All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight, presented by FanDuel here at The Volume. Happy Friday, everybody. Congrats on making it to the weekend. We are moving on with our power rankings today with number 9, the Dallas Mavericks. Very interesting team that had a very successful season last year and has made a couple of interesting changes during this offseason. We're going to get right into it. Before we get started, subscribe to The Volume's YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss any show announcements. And last but not least, if you can't finish one of these and you can't get back over to YouTube, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. So let's talk some basketball. The Dallas Mavericks last year went 52-30. They lost in 5 kind of ugly, disappointing fashion in the Western Conference Finals to the Golden State Warriors. Andrew Wiggins gave Luka a nightmare playoff series, the worst playoff series that he's had since he came into this league. We're going to talk a lot about some of the details of that series later on in the show. In the regular season, they were 14th in offense and 7th in defense. In this offseason, the two biggest changes from last year's roster is obviously they lost Jalen Brunson to the New York Knicks. Now, that makes this a little bit tough to project moving forward because the Dallas Mavericks offensive system is designed on 3 ball handlers. And there's always 2 on the floor at any given moment, and then they might close with all 3. But the idea is they're constantly spelling each other in the rotation. And so losing Jalen Brunson is a pretty significant loss. Now, over in Europe, Dennis Schroeder is playing some of the best basketball of his career for Germany. So, and there's a lot of intel out there that he will be picked up by an NBA roster pretty quickly after this tournament over there. So my expectation is that there's a great fit here for both sides between the Dallas Mavericks and Dennis Schroeder. First of all, Dallas desperately needs that third ball handler. And second of all, Dennis Schroeder, in terms of what he could do while he's in Dallas, this is an excellent place to go, especially in a contract year, which obviously is a player who will be signing some form of short-term deal and needs to prove himself. This is a great place to go to put up numbers because with the way that Dallas's offense is set up, and we're going to get a lot deeper into that, Dennis is going to be set up to succeed. He's going to be operating in a lot of space, and the ball is going to be in his hands, and he's going to be asked to run a lot of isolation and a lot of pick and roll. So I think there's a really natural fit there, and I think that those are the two sides that will come to an agreement. So I expect someone like Dennis Schroeder to be a Dallas Maverick to fill into that role. But for this exact moment in time, they're down to just the 2 ball handlers with the loss of Jalen Brunson. But they did trade for Christian Wood, losing only players who were not in their rotation during the playoffs. And now Christian Wood, it's tough because he's a super talented forward that can dribble and shoot better than the vast majority of big men that we have in this league and has a great deal of athleticism, but he's been playing in losing environments his entire career. And we kind of briefly touch on this topic a lot during this show, but the concept of winning basketball, and it's very, very different from just running up and down the floor and scoring. I tell this story all the time, but when I was a freshman in college, I was on a really bad team, and I averaged 16 points a game and had a bunch of big scoring nights. But I wasn't a good basketball player. I was just putting up numbers on a bad team. And then my worst statistical season was on the best team I played for. And on that particular team, I had to learn how to contribute defensively, learn how to contribute in a spot-up role, learn how to contribute by running plays correctly and guarding the other team's best player. It was a completely different type of basketball and role than I had my first year in JUCO. Even though I was more skilled, even though I was older, even though I was more physically developed at that point, it's just different doing it in a winning concept than it is in a losing concept. So over the course of the show, when we get to the offense portion and the defense portion, I'll do the best I can to guess how Christian Wood will impact winning within this winning concept, because it probably won't look anything like what he did in Houston. I was talking to my buddy Roosh, who covers the Rockets earlier today, and he works for Ball is Life as well. And he was telling me like the kinds of shots he was taking, they were using him like Kevin Durant, like flying off of screens or bringing the ball up the floor, taking step back threes. He actually shot 38% on step back threes or on off the dribble threes last year on over 1 attempt per game. Chances are he's not going to be taking a lot of those types of shots with Dallas. So those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about, and we will get into that further in the show. They drafted Jaden Hardy, a scoring guard. I don't think he'll be much of a factor this season. Don't know a ton about him either. So as the season progresses, if he does get playing time, I'll update you guys on that. And then they signed JaVale McGee. Again, I covered JaVale McGee when he was with the Los Angeles Lakers in 2020. He's a solid backup center. Different in the sense that he's very up and down. JaVale McGee's highs are incredibly high, like incredible dunks, a really gifted roll man, and who has surprisingly good hands, and is surprisingly good at finishing around the basket. Defensively, he can be a real problem for people underneath the basket because of how long he is. He's got great length for the position. But the flip side of that is that he's kind of a bull in a china shop is not the right word. He's kind of just like all over the place. Like he's kind of aloof a lot of the times. He leaves his feet on almost every single pump fake and will get himself out of position. Offensively, he'll freelance every once in a while and try something crazy, and it'll look kind of awkward and ugly, right? That's kind of the JaVale McGee experience. But the bottom line is he's your classic rim running center that can play drop coverage on one end and screen and roll hard to the rim on the other. Totally fine and serviceable in a backup center role. The big thing that I like specifically there for this defense is last year, Dallas's defense didn't really have a traditional rim protector, and they had a top 10 defense in spite of that. Now, there are some other factors at play that will be interesting to see how their defense looks this year, but JaVale McGee at least gives Jason Kidd an option as a rim protecting center that he did not have in previous years. And then, like I said, Dennis Schroeder is the guy that I'd keep an eye on as a signing as we get closer to camp. So their depth chart right now, as it looks at the guard, Luka, I guess you can call him a guard. Usually I say you are who you can guard, but Luka can't really guard anybody at this point. Maybe he can guard big players in the post, but that's about it. Luka Doncic, Spencer Dinwiddie, Reggie Bullock, and Frank Ntilikina. I think I pronounced that correctly. He played a little bit for them last year in the playoffs, but his inability to knock down jump shots has always been a problem in his career. Very gifted defensive player, though. On the wings, Tim Hardaway Jr. should theoretically be back from injury this year. Dorian Finney-Smith, who's turned into a really, really impactful 3-and-D player. Josh Green came through the University of Arizona, similar to Frank Ntilikina, good defensive player, good athlete, but his jump shot just isn't dependable enough right now. And then Davis Bertans, who is an incredibly streaky three-point shooter. At the as far as bigs go, they got Christian Wood. I'm calling him a big, but they might use him a little bit as a wing this year. JaVale McGee, Dwight Powell, and Maxi Kleber. So, on offense, this is an extremely modern pick and roll and matchup attacking offense. I talked about this yesterday with the Miami Heat, but your offensive process and your defensive process needs to be geared towards what your talent is on the roster. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble when you try to inflict your ideologies on a team if that's not their individual strengths, right? But in a vacuum, if I could pick my personnel, the two systems that I believe the most in terms of what translates best to the postseason are on defense, switching everything, which we talked about yesterday with Miami, and on offense, 5-out drive and kick. And the core principle there, though, is advantage creation with a live dribble. The main reason why I believe so much in that is that when you get into the postseason, and we've talked about this a ton on the show, but your sets don't seem to function as well as they do in the regular season. Not a big shock. There's a whole lot of scouting. You become deeply familiar with your opponent over the course of the 2 weeks of the playoff series, and teams will find a way to get in front of your sets. Also, teams tend to switch more in the postseason, which allows them to get in front of screening actions. So generally speaking, in the playoffs, it does become about live dribble advantage creation. That's why a team like Dallas, who was 14th in offense in the regular season, because they didn't get as many easy shots from running sets and things along those lines, that offense translated better to the postseason. And that's a huge part of why they were as successful as they were. And at times looked unguardable, especially against Phoenix and against Utah. So they don't, like, when we look at their numbers, they're 27th in off-screen actions in terms of total frequency, 18th in dribble handoffs, 24th in cutting. They're not running the offenses that you see from Golden State and Miami with a ton of motion and a ton of screens and a ton of dribble handoffs. That's just not what you're going to get from the Dallas Mavericks. They are a brute force, spread you out, high pick and roll and isolation offense. And they run it with three creators. It's your turn, my turn. One guy subs out, another guy comes in, and it's just more and more of the same. And it is a proven playoff offense. I've kind of joked that this team reminds me a lot of the 2018 Rockets. They don't switch as much on defense as the Rockets did, but that's kind of like their approach. It's super modern, can get ugly at times. It's not the most aesthetically appealing basketball, especially to basketball purists who like to see passing and ball movement, but you can't deny its effectiveness. I mentioned how they work with the three shot creators and kind of rotate them in and out. Off of that, it's all play finishers. They either have shooters or roll men, with Dorian Finney-Smith and Reggie Bullock, Maxi Kleba, Davis Bertans. They're all spotting up looking to shoot, but then they've got, Dwight Powell rolling hard to the rim. They've added 2 additional roll men this year in JaVale McGee and Christian Wood. And when we get to the numbers, you'll see they weren't as good a pick and roll team as they were an isolation team. Improving with their roll men, I think, will open some things up for them in pick and roll, make them a little bit more versatile on that front. The advantages that this type of offense creates, like there's a reason why it translates well to the postseason. Any coach can coach their way ahead of an offense, right? Like if you drill things enough, especially in a playoff series, and you really get good at covering the specific types of sets and concepts that a team likes to run, you can get in front. But if it's just pick and roll or just isolation, it becomes a simple question of picking your poison as a defense. You can either opt to send extra defensive attention to the ball handler and make him beat you with the pass. Or if you play off and stay home, it's about that person and their ability to make shots in that isolation or in that pick and roll. It becomes less about scheme and more about personnel. And that's a big part of why it translates to the postseason. There is no magic fix for isolation with Luka Doncic. If he's going to pick on your weakest defender, it's not like you can coach up that defender to do better and better. I mean, you might be able to get him to do a little bit better over repetition in the series, but the truth of the matter is if he's too small to guard Luka, he's too small to guard Luka. And there's no coaching around that beyond throwing extra defenders, and Luka happens to be one of the best passers in basketball. So again, like I appreciate aesthetically appealing basketball. I appreciate, ball movement and passing and that team game that a lot of old-fashioned basketball fans love. But at the end of the day, this works and you have to acknowledge it and find the beauty in the process. Like I talk a lot about skill on this show, specifically like little tips and tricks within ball handling and post-ups in terms of, how to sell each move or body positioning and things like that. Find beauty in that from their offense, and you'll learn to enjoy that a lot more. The manner in which Spencer Dinwiddie and Luka Doncic do what they do in terms of their offensive skill set, to me, is very fascinating. One of the downsides to their specific style of offense, their kind of heliocentric advantage creation offense, is their role players can lose confidence from time to time. They're specialists. They don't have a ton of guys on their team that can dribble, pass, and shoot. There's just a lot of guys that can either shoot or roll hard to the rim, but they don't get a lot of the multiple drive and kick system type stuff that can get a team in rotation a lot. And more often than not, they walk the ball up the floor, cross half court at 16 seconds, take another 4 or 5 seconds to get into their pick and roll or to get into their isolation. And by the time Luka or Spencer, whoever it is, makes the pass, there's only like 4 seconds on the shot clock. And it's like you're either shooting that three or you're taking a one dribble pull up, or maybe you can kick one more pass to another shooter. But they don't get the multiple driving kick possessions that can really get a defense in rotation. That's one of their weaknesses. And as a result, and it's a personnel thing. They don't really have the personnel to do that. But as a result, like, look at the Warriors series. Maxi Kleber, his shot stops falling, doesn't have other ways to score, other ways to impact the game. So he loses his confidence and the offense suffers for it. Like, that tends to be the case with this type of offense, is when the role players are feeling good and knocking down shots, everything's great. But when they start missing, it can kind of snowball from there. And if you look at that Golden State series, man, did things snowball, especially from the role players. They had some really cold shooting stretches that killed them, not the least of which was that second half of game 2 that they blew. So like I said, 27th in off-screen actions, 18th in dribble handoffs, and 24th in cutting in terms of frequency, so you're not getting any of that. It's all ISO and pick and roll. They were 5th in ISO frequency, 2nd in ISO efficiency. Luka ran 6.3 isolations per game, which was 2nd in the league in terms of volume. He also had 1.11 points per possession, which is amazing. There were only 2 players in the league last year that ran at least 5 ISOs and scored at least 1.1 point per possession on them. Take a guess. Luka and Kevin Durant. Spencer Dinwiddie also runs about 3 isolations per game and was even more efficient than Luka at 1.15 points per possession. He's going to be slotting up into that secondary creator, probably will start for them this year. They were 8th in pick and roll frequency and 5th in pick and roll efficiency. Again, I think that will go up in terms of volume with the addition of Christian Wood and JaVale McGee, because now they just have real role threats. Luka ran 13 pick and rolls per game last year, which was 2nd most in the NBA. He scored 0.93 points per possession, which is only slightly above average. Again, not having a legitimate role man, kind of Dwight Powell's an okay role man, but not as good as the 2 guys they're bringing in. That I think will open things up for him a little bit more in that regard. Spencer Dinwiddie was also only slightly above average in pick and roll. Jalen Brunson really carried them in pick and roll last year. He was in the 91st percentile in points per possession. So with him coming out, obviously you need someone else in there, hopefully Schroeder, but also the addition of better role men should kind of make up for some of that loss. They used to post up a lot when they had Kristaps Porzingis on the roster, but they ditched that almost entirely after Kristaps left. Luka is really the only player on the team that will post up at this point. He did it about 3 times per game last year and was relatively efficient. Nothing exceptional, but a little bit above average. Christian Wood ran some post-ups with Houston last year and was slightly above average, I think on about 2 attempts per game. So I'll be interested to see if they dump it down to him in the post a little bit, but I doubt it, because the league seems to be going away from that in general, and there's only a handful of guys in the league that can do it really well. So I think they'll probably use him more in a perimeter-oriented role or as a role man. The Dallas Mavericks ran in transition less than any team in the entire league. They had the fewest transition possessions. This is about Luka strangling the pace of the game. Now, there's downsides there, because when you don't run in transition, you don't get easy opportunities that supplement the rest of your offense. And like we talked about with the Miami Heat, especially when you're a team that can struggle to score a little bit in the half court, having handfuls of possessions each quarter where you run out for layups can help a lot. Now, it's about strangling the pace, which disrupts the rhythm of the other team. You miss a shot, Luka slowly brings the ball up the floor and methodically works the clock down and gets a good look and hits something, or one of his teammates makes a shot. Then you bring it back up the floor. It's been so long since you had the basketball. The game just feels like it's stuck in the mud. It makes it hard for offensive players to feel comfortable. So that's the upside. But I wouldn't hate to see, especially with how gifted of a passer Luka is and how gifted a rebounder he is, I wouldn't hate to see him do a little bit more of what Nikola Jokic does, and that's look up the floor after the rebounds. Luka can strangle the pace with his dribble. That doesn't mean the role players necessarily have to walk up the court too. I'd like to see a little bit more of like Dorian Finney-Smith and Reggie Bullock sprinting like crazy up the floor. Even a little JaVale McGee. He did this a little bit when he was with the Lakers with LeBron throwing passes up the floor. But trying to squeeze out a little bit more offense in transition, I think, would be a good idea. So let's talk about Christian Wood and how he fits in here. So again, in this particular type of role with him being on a winning team, he's not going to have the ball in his hands as an initiator nearly as much as he did in Houston. So that puts him into that play finisher role, right? Well, let's take a look at what he did last year in terms of specific shot profile. So he was 41% on wide open threes. That's really good. He was 40% on catch and shoot threes. So bam, before we go any further, he's already going to fit in this system as a spot up threat. He was 38% on pull-up threes, 1.3 attempts per game. Interesting in the sense that I don't think you're going to want him taking pull-up threes early in the offense, but what that does amount to me is like a late clock threat. You know, Luka goes to a step back with 5 on the shot clock, doesn't get enough separation, kind of pump fakes. He can swing it to Christian Wood, and Christian Wood can hit a step back. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like a rescue possession type of thing. He was in the 67th percentile as a roll man. When I was talking to my buddy Roosh, who covered the Rockets last year, again, it was a waste of my time because of how much I had to cover the top teams in the league. It was a waste of my time to watch that much of Christian Wood. I only watched him a handful of times. So I rely a lot on the tape that I've seen, as well as people who watched him every single day, like my buddy Roosh, and then the data we have on the NBA.com website. But he said that they were actually pretty damn good with Christian Wood as a roll man, but that he was hesitant to do so. That translates to the numbers, 67th percentile, but his volume was pretty low. I want to say he was only registering about 2 roll man possessions per game. So it theoretically, in this system, that translates to something he'll do more frequently. He was also a slightly above average isolation player and a slightly above average post player in terms of points per possession. So what of that contributes to a winning environment? Obviously, the spot up stuff. Obviously, attacking closeouts, his ability to dribble the basketball and his athleticism going to the rim might be able to open some things up in driving kick types of situations. And then also, if the post up and isolation stuff translates in terms of the winning environment, it'd be interesting to see him as just another option for advantage creation when he has a great matchup. So, for instance, if Christian Wood ends up in a pick and roll getting a switch onto Luka's man, and Luka can pull the ball away and throw it down to him in the post, or if he, even just in transition running the floor, if he gets the right matchup, it might be interesting to throw to him as a primary initiator. I think you'll find out pretty quickly in the first 10 or so games of the season whether or not that's something Christian Wood's capable of doing in a winning concept, or winning context, I should say. He's a player that the Dallas Mavericks have never had before, a type of player that the Dallas Mavericks have never had before. So I'm just really interested to see how they end up using him. Defense was where the Dallas Mavericks were most interesting last year. Again, they were 7th in defensive rating. But their personnel wasn't very good, right? Like, outside of Reggie Bullock, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Dwight Powell, they didn't really have players that were, their reputations weren't that of great defensive players. Most of them below average. Jalen Brunson, Spencer Dinwiddie, Luka Doncic, Maxi Kleber, all these guys were, Davis Bertans, these were all below average defensive players before this particular season. They were, as a team last year, they were 29th in steals, 28th in blocks, so they weren't disrupting anything. They didn't have an interior defensive presence. Like, Dwight Powell is a good defensive forward, but it's not like he's a rim protector, right? Neither was Maxi Kleber. All of that stuff was true, but they had the 7th best defense in basketball. How do you do that? And the answer to me is pretty simple. If you guys remember yesterday when I was talking about the Miami Heat, I was talking about how on offense, they squeeze things out on the margin to improve their offense despite being a weak half-court offense. The same goes for the defensive end of the floor. I compared it to football and baseball in terms of like special teams or like manufacturing runs with like bunting to get a base runner on, or stealing bases, sacrifice flies, things along those lines. There's like the core concept of basketball, which is scoring in a half court 5-on-5 environment. But then there's all these ancillary things: defensive rebounding, offensive rebounding, transition defense, transition offense, right? Like we talked, I went over all the different things yesterday, but this particular team, this Dallas Mavericks defense, despite not having the right personnel, was able to squeeze out an above average defense by all of the little things. So for instance, they defended the 3-point line really well, which is just scheming. That's smart. It's math. That's the most valuable shot. If you that and layups are the most valuable shot. Now, they were a pretty average paint defense, to be expected, but if you guard the 3-point line and you guard the paint really well, you'll force teams to operate in the mid-range. And and no player in the league really, except for the top handful, is efficient enough in that range to make you pay. So they only allowed 10.9 made threes per game, which led the league. They were 8th in free throw attempts allowed, so they don't foul. Again, that's coaching. They were an above average transition defense, getting back in transition, communicating with each other, who's got the paint, spreading out to your shooters after that. And they were a top 10 defensive rebounding team. They secured 73.3% of available defensive rebounds. So again, like, even though they weren't great defensively in the core principles of defense, they were excellent in all these ancillary things. They had a smart scheme. They guarded the 3-point line well. They double every mismatch. They double their players out of mismatches when that becomes a problem. They rotate really well when things break down. They don't foul. They get back in transition. By doing those things, they were able to squeeze out and grind out the number 7 defense in the league. It's about controlling what you can control. You can't control your personnel, but you control being well coached. You can control boxing out. You can control sprinting back on defense in transition. You can control coming up with a smart scheme by paying attention to what's going on around you in the league. The unfortunate reality was, and this is what I said all last season, you Mavericks fans who listened last year will remember, as their defense was progressing towards the tail end of the season, I kept pointing out the fact that the personnel might end up being a problem in a playoff series against a team that can expose them. Well, Golden State just completely put them in the blender. I want to say their defensive rating in the regular season was about 109 points per 100 possessions allowed. Golden State scored 120.3 points per 100 possessions. So their discipline, all of those things that we talked about, just didn't hold up under Golden State's motion-heavy offense. So they fell apart on that front. Now, some of this is Golden State. Golden State's a really unique team. They do things very differently. It's differently than anybody else in the league. So there's not really a whole lot you can do to prepare for them. And I've talked about this a lot on the show, but Golden State tends to have an advantage early in playoff series because of the fact that what they do is so different. And it's not incredibly uncommon to fall down 2-0 to them. That's what happened, and they weren't able to dig out. Let's look at Christian Wood on the defensive end of the floor for just a second. He was a horrible defensive player in Houston, but it was for a very bad team. He does have the athletic tools. He's tall, he's got long arms, he can move his feet. The problem is that defensive habits and defensive IQ takes time to build. So it's just going to be a really interesting challenge for Jason Kidd and for Christian Wood himself to make that transition quickly. Because it's either going to... Christian Wood's a good basketball player. He's going to be in this league for a long time. My guess is he'll be a very, very good role player at a minimum 5-10 years, or not 10 years, but 5 years from now, right? Like when he's in his early 30s. But the question is it going to take him until then to learn how to be a productive defensive player? Or is it something that he can figure out in one training camp with Jason Kidd? That's a huge swing factor for this particular season. I'm really curious to see what happens. The best case scenario for this team is basically everything that happened in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. It's modern basketball personified. Maximizing things on the margins, slowing the pace down, strangling the game down into a isolation contest where it's like you're trying to go punch for punch with Luka Doncic in this slow game that's just stuck in the mud. And Luka is one of the best isolation players in the league and one of the best pick and roll players in the league. So he's going to beat you a lot of the time in that. And that's what he did to Utah, and that's what he did to Phoenix. But Luka fell apart against Golden State. He only shot 41.5% in that series. a lot of credit to Andrew Wiggins and the job that he did on him. But in order for them to hit their ultimate ceiling, which is holding the Larry O'Brien trophy, and I absolutely think the Mavericks have that capability, Luka would have to remain hot for 4 series, for 16 wins. Definitely something he's capable of. He eventually ran out of gas in the conference finals last year. In order to reach this ceiling, I think they absolutely have to sign somebody to replace Brunson. I think Dennis Schroeder is the obvious choice. I don't think they're a contender unless they get that third creator, but I am calling them a contender because I sincerely believe they will get that guy, even if it's not Dennis Schroeder. What if Christian Wood brings a huge scoring punch and finds a way to fit in defensively? That's a big swing factor because he's a fringe all-star level talent. He's not a fringe all-star. He's a fringe all-star level talent in terms of what he brings to the table as a basketball player. If all of that comes together, they can win the title. But make no mistake, it's all on Luka. I've described this tier as the puncher's chance tier. And the puncher, in this case, is Luka. And if he's not at his absolute best for all 4 rounds, they can't get it done. He's the guy who holds all the pressure in that regard. Worst case scenario is they fail to find that third creator and they go to it with Spencer Dinwiddie and Luka, and they lack shot creation all season. Their defense takes a step back, just like it did in the Golden State series. Their lack of an interior presence gets them killed on the glass. Golden State pulled in 57% of available rebounds in that particular series, although I do think JaVale McGee will help on that a lot. If those sorts of things happen, they're certainly at risk to lose in the second round as well. The first round. Just about every team the rest of the way, their low side is to lose in the first round. There is no world-beating roster out there. I would say only 4 teams like Clippers, Celtics, Warriors, and Bucks would be like guarantees to win their first round series. But even then, injuries could take them out. And when we're talking about worst case scenario, we have to factor in injuries. Just ask the Milwaukee Bucks with what happened with Chris Middleton last year. So for the X Factor, what's been the theme for X Factors throughout this whole series? What kind of player have I typically been picking? It's typically been a young player who has a ton of talent, but hasn't quite reached his ultimate ceiling, thus providing a ton of variance in what could happen this season. Well, going to go with Christian Wood then, because that makes a ton of sense for that theme, right? To be consistent. He's skilled and athletic enough to be an all-star, but he has to learn how to impact winning, and those are 2 completely separate things. I deal with this a lot with young players here in town, especially with the high school kids that I coach. Like there's a bridge that goes between being a talented basketball player and a winning basketball player. My friend Talib Ukta, who was an All-American when I was at Arizona Christian University, he taught me how to win little by little over the course of my last season in college. He would take me to these like late night 3-on-3 runs at the school, and put me on his team, and just coached me really hard. And not on the. I was always a very talented basketball player, 6'6", 6'10" wingspan, could jump out of the gym, could dribble, shoot, all those things. But I was so raw because I started really late. And so I'd like hit a tough step back jump shot or make a really nice driving dunk or something along those lines. And he would never say anything about that because he didn't care. He already knew I could do that stuff. But like every time that like I'd roll to the basket on a screen and roll and get a dunk, but then on the next possession I'd screen and pop, he'd like scream at me and be like, "What are you doing? What you just did worked. Why would you not do it again?" And over time, I would learn like we would relentlessly go to the same action until they figured out how to stop it. Every time I missed a defensive box out, screaming at me. Defensive rebounds are how you win games, Jason. You have to get every single defensive rebound. A bad closeout, bad defensive possession, whatever it was. Over the course of that year in those nighttime runs, he slowly chipped away at me and taught me about the things that make a winning basketball player. And like I'll never forget that particular year because that was the year that I learned how to be a winner on so many different levels, going from being a scorer at the JUCO level to being a role player alongside 2 All-American guards on one of the best NAIA teams in the country. Like that was where I learned all of that stuff. And fortunately, I was able to pick it up pretty quickly. But that's going to be the challenge for Christian Wood, is how quickly can he pick up on those things? Because right now, as any Rockets fan will tell you, he's not good at those things. Rockets fans would joke, according to my friend Roosh, that every time they'd play a big man, he'd have his career year because Christian Wood, or career game, because Christian Wood was guarding him. He's lacking in those areas. And so it'll be interesting to see how quickly he can pick those up. How quickly can he become a serviceable defender, and how quickly can he understand his role within the Mavericks offense? The closer he gets to that all-star level, which obviously he's not that guy, but he's going to be somewhere between where he is now and that level. The closer he is to that level, the higher Dallas' ceiling is, and that's why he's such a big X factor. All right, guys, that is all I have on the Dallas Mavericks. That's all we have for this week. We will be back on Monday with number 8. As always, I sincerely appreciate your guys' support, and I will see you guys next week.